Okay, so everybody is here. Why don't we kick things off? We're about a couple minutes past, and it looks like there's a good amount of people in here. So thanks to everybody for joining today. Today's discussion is the first of what we hope will be many conversations about Zcash and the future of funding and governance. So why don't we start off with some background on governance and funding? So um, from the first halving until recently, Zcash governance operated as a two of two multi-sig governance model between ECC and the Zcash
I'm not
Foundation.
hearing anybody. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Check, check. We can hear you, Josh.
Can you hear me?
Clearly not.
Could anybody hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I can hear you, Jason.
Same.
Okay. Okay, good. So I'll wait for him to get back up. I'll start with the background though. Like I'll just get through it since Josh is already familiar with this stuff. Um, So the trademark agreement was a bilateral agreement that ultimately determined what chain gets recognized as Zcash. It also included another provision that required both entities to approve any network upgrade before it can be implemented. There was a section that prohibited either party from taking actions that violate the clear consensus of the Zcash community, but it didn't define what constitutes community consensus. So the foundation would use Zcap as a tool, and ECC would pull via their Zcash ad hoc council. So during the same time,
but they only started doing that fairly late on. For a long time, they were
100%.
Yeah.
It was Zuko making the decision or whoever was in that leadership role. So during the same time, funding was determined by ZIP 1014, which had 20% of the block rewards going to the development fund that got allocated in three slices to ECC, the Zcash Foundation, and ZCG. The dev fund ran from November 2020 to November 2024. So earlier this year, ECC withdrew from the trademark agreement, which, if I understand correctly, effectively voided a number of governance provisions contained in the agreement that I alluded to earlier, but still gives the foundation control over what chain gets recognized as Zcash. And the community is still waiting to hear back from the foundation regarding if it commits to limiting the use of the trademark to non-governance related activities. Around the same time as ECC withdrew from the trademark agreement, the community had discussions about whether to continue the dev fund. There were months of discussions this past summer. A number of proposals were put forward, and in the end, the community decided to create a new dev fund for 1 year that sends 12% of block rewards to a protocol lockbox and 8% to ZCG, while the community decides on a new governance and funding model. So some of the main takeaways from those discussions and community polling were that the community does not want to provide direct funding to organizations. The community wants to transition to a grants-based non-direct funding model. We want to further decentralize governance, and we have to develop a disbursement mechanism and governance process for future funding allocations. So basically, that's what we're here to talk about today. There have been two governance proposals that have been put forward, both by Josh of ECC, and we're going to spend today discussing one of those proposals, which is called the Zcash Funding Bloc. Josh is going to give an overview, and we'll discuss like the pros and cons of it. And then one motivation of having this call is to move these discussions forward because we're running out of time. And we're hoping that these conversations will answer some of your questions about the Zcash Funding Bloc and other governance models, and hopefully inspire some people to put forward their own proposals. So today we've got Jack Gavigan of the Zcash Foundation, Josh Swihart of the Electric Coin Company, Squirrel or Jason from ZecHub, me, the other Jason from Shielded Labs and ZCG. And yeah, we're looking forward to a lively discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to discuss, moderation and then open it up to the panel.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And thanks to the speakers for being here and everybody listening in. We'll try to keep a strict moderation policy, and given the importance of some of these topics and all the organizations involved in the community, we want to make sure that the conversation is respectful and productive. So no interrupting, please. Feel free to chime in or raise your hand after someone's done talking. And then at the end, we're going to open it up to the listeners to ask some questions. And so with that said, we're going to get started with an overview, and we're going to toss it over to Josh. And so Josh, could you provide an overview of the Zcash Funding Bloc proposal and explain the motivation behind it?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yes.
Awesome. Is there a way to post the proposal, the original proposal, in the chat? It might be helpful for some. There's some pictures in there, both there, and there's a post at about just under 50 posts down, because there was a lot of response, that has another model that might be useful for referencing for some people. So
Sure.
Yeah, I'll try to grab that link.
Okay, thank you. So while they're doing that, I know some people have said it or have responded and looked at it and that kind of thing. So in terms of the context of where some of this came from, I had left ECC about a year and a half ago. And as I was on my way out the door, I was pretty vocal about changes I had hoped to see in the community and wanted to be able to kind of speak freely about some of that. And so, as Jason talked about, governance has been, until recently, this kind of 2 of 2 multi-sig, where the foundation and ECC jointly agreed to reflect the wishes of the community, but in a way that was relatively subjective. So there's a CCAP for the foundation, and ECC, it was just based upon what ECC thought that the community wanted, it just in terms of governance itself. And then both organizations were guaranteed funding, for a period of time, both kind of at the time of the Founders Reward and then the 4 years of the Dev Fund after. So I had been an outspoken critic and felt like some changes were needed that would better align. And at the time, I didn't have any kind of foreknowledge or ambition even of coming back to ECC. But when I did, in December of last year, I was again pretty intent on, at least for ECC's part, seeing some change. And so within the things that we could control, it was to withdraw from the trademark agreement, and to work with the community on alternative mechanisms for funding and governance. So that's some of the background. The idea with the block is that the funding block, or the Z block, is that I believe that the governance should be further decentralized over time. There isn't a magic bullet, and all kinds of projects have played with various different kinds of mechanisms for governance. But it should be something that's implementable, that does increasingly decentralize, and that's flexible and resilient, so that it can change and be modified as we kind of go down this path of this kind of grand experiment together, and figure out what the right kind of governance model is for Zcash. So the Z block, or the idea for it, was born. And there's an assumption in it, and the assumption is that the community would want to continue to provide funding for organizations, development funding for organizations. And basically, my assumption is that it would want to continue at 20%, and that was before we went through this process that Jason mentioned before. That's what the community indicated, that it wanted to continue to have funding, but it rather than come up with a solution, it allocated a certain amount of funds to a lockbox, and then the rest to Zcash community grants. In this model, governance of the protocol and funding of major teams is determined by a KN multi-sig on chain. And the signers are all community delegates, essentially. And so each delegate has a key, And when the community has a question of governance or funding request, a majority of key holders must sign before it's approved. In the original one, I had suggested that maybe the initial delegates come from ECC, ZF, and ZCG, and then another for the coin holders through some kind of voting mechanism. And then, as we had the conversation, there was these kinds of ideas about adding other parties like the Zec Hub DAO, perhaps a delegate from a community of the core engineers that were across the ecosystem at ZF and ECC and other places. And then again, kind of a big one is coin holders, and giving more coin holders more of a voice and more of a voice over time. I did have that KV and multisig was intended for kind of larger governance and funding issues. And the concept of the ZCG in this model is that they would be, potentially a body that is delegated or that has responsibility for smaller grants. So, perhaps they have a per grant cap of 100K and an annual cap of 20% of the total aggregate dev fund or something like that, so that the wheels don't kind of grind to a stop with larger decisions, or with smaller decisions. Excuse me. There's again in that thread, there's an FAQ, and I try to answer a bunch of questions there. Again, I think it's about 50 posts down if you scroll down. But that's the crux of the structure.
Great, thank you, Josh. So a follow-up question to that for the panel members, what are your overall thoughts on the funding block, and how well do you think it aligns with the community's goals for decentralization, accountability, and allocating funding? Or if there's anything else that Josh said that somebody wanted to respond to, but maybe first we'll kick it over to Dodger.
Hey, yeah. So I think that the proposal has a few drawbacks. I think, first of all, it centralizes power in the block members or the signatories or whatever you want to call them, and it effectively creates incentives for horse trading, influence peddling, and just general politicking. And I think that everybody in the ecosystem is heartily sick of all of that. And it would be nice to be able to get to a situation where there was a simpler and clearer and more transparent way of deciding how funds are allocated. And I think the big obstacle that I perceive, and this is why we, the ZF, would need to take legal advice, certainly on if the community were to go ahead with this thing, whether we would become part of that block, and that's that it makes the delegates a major target in terms of legal and regulatory issues. So for liability, sanctions. And I can tell you, you do not want to be on the receiving end of a subpoena that means that you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers and discovery, even if you've done nothing wrong. And if somebody wants to indemnify those delegates and put a few million into escrow to pay their legal bills, fine. But otherwise, they would either need to have very deep pockets or the support of an organization that has deep pockets. And then thirdly, I think that there are simply better alternatives. There's a lot of talk about putting more power in the hands of the community, and that's something that we at ZF have been doing for years. And there's no reason why the community can't vote directly on proposals, to receive funding from the lockbox. We actually effectively prototyped that with the ZF Minor Grants program. We set a budget, we invited grant applications with a specific set of criteria. And then we didn't decide which ones get funded. We filtered them to make sure that they met the criteria and they weren't illegal or anything like that. But we polled the community, and we kicked it out to ZCAP, and we said, which of these proposals do you approve? And then the grants were funded in order of the level of approval that they got, with a caveat that they had to receive at least 50% plus one vote from the people who took part in the poll. And that worked incredibly well. In fact, I was hugely surprised that both times we did that, the community was, I would say, more kind of conservative and judicious in their funding decisions than I think a group of people would have been. So yeah, I think that the funding bloc's an interesting idea, and I think that there are a whole bunch of other ideas out there, many of which are likely to be better, and I hope that we can discuss many of them and start to circle around a few that we think have got legs.
Thanks, Dodger. Yeah, I think as more proposals come in, the goal here is to have more of these spaces that are focused on each one of those, so we as a community can go over them. So yeah, Jason or Squirrel, any initial thoughts on the funding block, how it aligns with the community's goals?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Squirrel.
Yeah, I reckon it's a fairly positive development in the Zcash ecosystem. So yeah, it does increase decentralization. Like, it's better than a 2 of 2 multi-sig, right? So I think one of the major concerns for potential people interested in Zcash is, like, one of the huge things that we've all heard is that Zcash is a CEO coin, and it's controlled by, like, some people think that it's controlled by one company. But yeah, you could say 2 organizations. And yes, there is Zcap. There are concerns, like, which have been raised in the past, of how Zcap polls are constructed and how Zcap members are invited, and it's a really deep rabbit hole. But this funding block, I think, it kind of solves that issue, if we're going to be honest. Yeah, so Dodger mentioned regulatory concerns with switching to the funding block, and he's completely correct. So we don't know what the future will hold. I think it was a few months ago that Peter Van Valkenburg mentioned that, in fact, it is at ZCon 5 that he said a really good thing about Zcash now is that it is, like, the Zcash Foundation is a US-based organization, and as such, it's protected by US law. So if something unjust were to happen, it could be challenged and go through the correct processes to get it resolved. So it's a question that actually has to be handed to everyone listening, right? Like, what do you prefer? You could go the option of, like, something like Bitcoin, which is just completely decentralized, and there is no target to go after, right? Of course, you could always go after developers, like what happened with Tornado Cash. That could also happen to Zcash maybe at some point. And even though it was deemed unlawful, the effect was just about the same as saying it's illegal, right? Like, people just don't want to associate with it. They don't want to use it. And it effectively shut down the protocol. Well, not stop it, but it's not being used. So these are some things to consider. Another important point, I think, is so accountability is a big one. Allowing coin holders to have their say, it would be a radical change I think it'd be a good one. Something I would like to see is perhaps like a bit more competition in how projects are funded. If it's just like, I don't know, 2 organizations and you've got ZCG, which is under ZF, there's sort of a risk like they're just choosing their own projects and they get to work on what they want, but things might become stagnant to some extent. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts. I think like this is the first meeting we're having on the funding block, and there's so much which is unclear. So like the decentralization point, we don't know how decentralized it's going to be, because yes, we could have ECC and ZF and Shielded Labs and ZCG and coin holders, but we don't know the weighting which each of those groups will have. So lots to consider.
Great points. Thanks, Squirrel. Jason?
Yeah, so I like how it essentially works like a DAO with a multi-sig signing authority. There's things that I like about it. One, like Jason highlighted, it's more decentralized than previous versions of governance, and it sort of distributes decision-making across these multiple constituencies, which I think helps sort of reduce the risk of, capture or control by a single entity, which has been a factor throughout Zcash governance. I also like that it's intended or designed to be flexible, meaning like you're able to add or remove members. So it's pretty dynamic and can adapt to changes in the ecosystem or with the community. The way that decision making works seems to be very clear, at least in the way that Josh outlined it in the post. Basically, the way I see it is you have a bunch of independent constituencies that vote on a proposal. There's no committee. There's no required meetings or discussions between constituencies. They're all very independent. And then I also like that it would focus on major grants, and then ZCG would still play a role in other grants. Right. So the problem is like if the Z block was responsible for making all funding decisions, then it might become very time consuming. It may not be very scalable. It may take important time away from the various leadership teams. They could be preoccupied with governance to where they're not delivering on their important development objectives, right? There's a couple criticisms I have with it. And I really sort of hear what Dodger's saying. Like I can't shake this fear that it will make Zcash governance much more political, like politics on steroids. And this can happen in multiple ways. Like if there's highly polarized factions among constituents, or there's competing agendas, or there's influence from more powerful constituents on less powerful constituents, or backroom deal making, etc. And I'm not sure, like it's just a fear. Like I wonder if it's possible to put some sort of restrictions or controls in place to mitigate some of that. But at this point, I think that it's a legitimate concern that sort of requires a good amount of discussion. And then the way that the proposal is currently written, I believe the intention is to have a significant percentage of funding to go to the Z block. And I think that we sort of need to recognize that this is very experimental and start off small at first and then iterate on it over time. Like it has a ton of potential, but the first version will probably be a mess, right? So if we start out small, it could be much more manageable. And then lastly, I guess I want to say something from like my perspective as a member of Shielded Labs. We're a donations-based organization. We don't plan on receiving funds from the Dev Fund or Lockbox, but we really like to see. We like this because one, the idea of coin holders being a constituency, I think, is important. And two, it not only extends to funding, but also governance, which encompasses like the sort of network upgrade process. But I can go into that a little later in the conversation. Let's stop there for now.
Thanks, Jason. Does any of the other speakers have anything on this first question? Any response to anything that anybody else said? Otherwise, I can jump to second question.
Yeah, can I respond maybe real quick to some of the things?
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
So like I hear the concern about politicking, and I don't disagree, right? It runs a risk. The reality is that that's where every governance system has that. The worst of it was what we've come out of with ECC and the ZF, and both the politicking and the antagonism. So we really need something new with some more voices. But I hear and agree that is a concern. One potential thing, in looking at this is allowing for some mechanism for a veto power as well. So that's something that is in the optimism governance system, which is a different proposal, is a bicameral system, which we can talk about at a later time. But giving some group or the ability to veto something that looks like it's being strong armed through, or there's some politics on the other side. So something like that might be useful to kind of consider. As it relates to the legal kind of concern, yes, that's there. Every legal thing, and it depends on how you ask the attorney, right? Every legal thing sits on a gradient, and it's a gradient of risk, and you're never going to get a yes or no answer. It's just not going to happen. I'm comfortable with the conversations that we've had with our attorneys that this is a much better system. So specifically, our attorneys are Arcturus. Mike Mosier is a partner there. Mike Mosier is the former director of FinCEN, or interim director. That's our counsel. So we've had those conversations. I won't go into, and can't, I don't think, go into all of the specifics. But after those conversations with Mike, I'm comfortable that this model is far superior in terms of our legal risk than the existing model and the old model under the trademark agreement. So take that for what it's worth. As it relates to the better alternatives, Jack's saying there's better alternatives. Great. So we need the proposals. So I put a couple out there with the caveat saying, like, these are two proposals for us to discuss. There's probably holes in them, poke them, which is what we're trying to do here. But please, more proposals. We need more ideas. So I'm all for that as well. But we need to get those away from kind of hand wavy kinds of things into more concrete things that we can talk about. That would be super helpful. That was it.
Thanks, Josh. Any other follow-up from any of the speakers? All right, cool. I think I can move on to the next question. I was going to say, I noticed just in response to something Josh just said, I think I saw Eiger recently announced their governance mechanism. And if I recall correctly, it includes giving coin holders some amount of veto power towards the end after proposals are being pushed through. I'll have to find that and I can share that. But yeah, let's.
Did you say Eiger?
Or yeah, I think. Oh, what's it called? I'm sorry, maybe I miss.
Saigon?
I'll find it and post. Okay, I don't see it right now. That's my fault. But yeah. Anyways, sorry about that. The next question here, which Jason touched on at the end of what he was saying. What types of decisions should fall under ZBloc's authority, and like, should it include both funding and governance, including network upgrades and the strategic direction for Zcash? Somebody want to lead with that?
I'll tell you what the intent was, and people can chime in on it. But the intent was, like, when I was initially thinking about it, I was thinking about it just in terms of funding, and as I looked at it, It looked, I mean, funding is governance, right? What we choose to fund impacts where the direction of the protocol. And I was having, like, it just didn't, at some point, it didn't make sense to try to decouple those for me and looking at this. So that the where it landed was that it was intended for both.
Yeah, so I mean, I think from my perspective, both funding and governance should fall under the authority of the Zcash Funding Bloc. For funding, like I already mentioned, I like that the Z Block handles major grants or big partnerships, and ZCG focuses on other grants. Part of me thinks that we probably shouldn't or even couldn't limit the size of ZCG grants. But instead sort of think of it as another grants pool that prospective grantees can tap. And the reason I say that is because now that ZCG is transitioning to FPF, I think it may have more independent authority than it previously had to sort of allocate funding as it sees fit, so long as it's in line with Cayman Island laws and regulations. But with regard to like network upgrades and other governance things, like I think one thing that's important is that there be more clarity and structure around the network upgrade process. And the reason why that's important is it sort of impacts some of the projects that we're working on, like the network sustainability mechanism and Crosslink. I've personally gone through the ZIP process and now the network upgrade process, and it's very unclear what's required for your feature to be included in network upgrade. One of the questions I had at the outset is like, do you need to poll the community and demonstrate consensus for it to get included? I would think so, but based on conversations that I've had with core engineers, it seems that's not always the case, that sometimes there's upgrades that are made with minimal discussion and no community approval. And for NU7, while the NSM was being scrutinized, there was very little conversation about things like deprecating Sprout or memo bundles and whether they should be prioritized over other features and included in NU6 until very late in the process when Dodger flagged it and mentioned it in a forum post. Now, I'm not saying that it's bad that it operates that way or that the core engineer teams are doing something wrong. In fact, I trust their judgment when it comes to these sorts of things, and sort of managing their complexity budget. But it's evident that there was no real process around network upgrades, and that's something that I think can be improved via a governance model like the Zcash Funding Bloc. And I think it's worth mentioning that like the way things currently work were fine when it was just ECC and ZF contributing to protocol development. But now you have Kedit developing ZSAs, you have Shielded Labs working on the NSM and Crosslink, and the more independent teams you have doing these things, the more you need clear processes for how upgrades occur. So I think the Z Block would give that, make decision making around that a little bit more easier. And there's other governance matters that it would probably help with too. Like, for example, when we had the Dev Fund discussions earlier this year, everyone and their mother was doing polling. We had ZCAB, Zacture, ZecHub, various other community polls. And on the one hand, it was kind of cool because, we saw this process move away from ZCAP as the sole polling mechanism to something more decentralized. But on the other hand, it was annoying and confusing for members of the community being polled. So I'm hopeful that something like ZBlock can be used to create more straightforward processes.
Dodger or Squirrel?
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, the funding block should be used in deciding funding. I agree. Governance, yeah, funding is tied to governance, like Josh said. Governance is also a lot of other things like the polling that you just mentioned, Jason, and things like this discussion and discussions on the forum and in Telegram. Like governance, I think is much wider. So it's much wider than the funding bloc, the decisions that the funding bloc will make. Like to me, the funding bloc itself is just like it's like a multi-sig, right? And the actual governance, the interactions, the discussions takes place across like a much wider space. Should the funding bloc be used for network upgrades or to decide on network upgrades? Personally, I'm not sure. I don't think so. Like, yeah, I attend a lot of the Arbor calls and I make the notes about what the engineers are discussing. And like you mentioned, like the engineers are just concerned with building the stuff, and the actual governance around the network upgrades does need to be clarified. I should note though, when it comes to network upgrades, like there is an existing process. Like if you want to create a Zcash improvement proposal, you can do that, and it can be scheduled for a network upgrade in future. So like there is kind of a component which already exists for people to use. Maybe it would help to yeah, like I guess provide more information for people on how they can participate in that bit. In terms of strategic direction for Zcash as a whole, it kind of gets complicated because like with funding things, many of these different groups, ECC, well, I would say ECC and ZF are fairly similar in that the projects that they're working on are multi-year, and that bit's going to get complicated. So like we have different types of projects that are being worked on in Zcash that maybe need different approaches, and so the funding bloc needs to be able to cater to projects that are like 4 years down the line and to projects which are like 2 months or something like that. So like strategic direction, yeah, it's a difficult one. I don't quite know the answer.
Yeah, I agree a lot with a lot of what you said there, Jason. I think that I think that the other Jason is right in that we have a problem today, which is absolutely great to have, which is that there are more people, more organizations, more teams contributing work intended to change the core Zcash protocol. And yes, our processes absolutely need to change. In the past, it was fairly well structured because it was really only ECC who were making changes to the core protocol. Then ZF came along, and while we were building Zebra and kind of catching up to Zcash these functionality, we were able to support ECC, but weren't really taking the lead on things. And now we're pretty much caught up. As soon as Zcash is deprecated, we'll be starting. Even before then, we'll be starting, looking at how we can improve and change the protocol that supports in a way that supports the sort of core Zcash mission. But they're kind of, if you think about models of governance, there are two broad. I wouldn't say these are the only two options, but these are two options I'm going to describe. One of them is direct democracy. So that's where you have your constituency and you get them to vote, and that could be Zcap, it could be coin voting, whatever. You just go and you put the power directly in the hands of the people through whatever mechanism, and then they get to vote, and that's great for certain types of decision. So I would say, for example, that's great if the question is, should we add ZSAs to the Zcash protocol, or should we add, should we adopt the network sustainability mechanism? Yes or no? Great, simple questions with an answer that is clear and that everybody really has a stake in. There's then more nuanced questions, and one of those has arisen in relation to NU7 and concerns around the complexity budget, and those are questions, and there are other matters that I think are, like, for example, running an organization. You don't want to be putting every single decision out to a vote of thousands of people and having them make minute decisions. You want to select a group of people, i.e. a board, and have them make decisions or delegate decisions as appropriate. And in relation to the network upgrade process, probably the single biggest issue that we're facing right now is how much can we get into a single network upgrade without risking catastrophe. And by catastrophe, I mean a scenario where it all goes wrong, the network upgrade activates, but the Zcash blockchain stops. And nobody can send transactions, nobody can deposit into an exchange, nobody can withdraw, and this has happened to a few chains, and it takes time to recover. And obviously there's a huge amount of pressure on the people who are responsible for making for fixing the problem, getting the fix tested and deployed and rolled out, reaching out to the ecosystem, coordinating the restart of the chain. It's an absolute nightmare, and I would far rather avoid it if we at all can. Now, on that question, how much can we fit in before the risk starts to become starts to make people uncomfortable? That's where I think we have to defer to the engineers, to the experts, to the people who are actually going to be burning the midnight oil trying to fix the problem if a problem actually arises. So on the one hand, should ZSAs go into the core protocol? I think that's a direct democracy thing. Should we try and squeeze ZSAs and NSM into the same network upgrade? I think that's one for the experts. And then the other final question is, okay, if we can't squeeze both ZSAs and NSM into the same protocol, then which one goes first? Which one do we prioritize? And I think, again, that's for the direct democracy thing. So yeah, I think that the network upgrade process does need to be overhauled. In the past, I think we were able to it just wasn't an issue. I hoped that in this instance there would be that consensus would emerge, that there would be a discussion, concerns would be raised, concerns would be acknowledged, and a little bit of common sense would prevail, and there would be a compromise reached that everybody was mildly unhappy with, which were what the best compromises are. But yeah, it may be that we need to pull the community and say, right, are you do you think ZSA should come first? Do you think NSM should come first? And then leave it up to the engineers to decide how much they can fit in and how much they feel safe fitting in. And it needs to be the engineers. It can't be me, can't be Josh, because that's the classic. The manager leans on the engineers to squeeze more in, which is not what I want to do. Maybe Josh does. I'll leave it up to him. But certainly, I don't want to do that with our engineers. Don't want to put them under unreasonable pressure. I've been an engineer in the past, not a software engineer, but a network and security engineer, and I've faced those pressures myself. So I don't want to impose them on anybody else. So yeah, definitely the network upgrade process, I think, needs to evolve, needs to change, needs to be a clear separation between those two questions of should something go in, and then how much can you jam in, and yeah, I think I've been looking very closely at the Ethereum process, and we might do a community call to get an overview of that, because I think that there may be some lessons there that we can take away, because I think we need to, whenever possible, avoid reinventing the wheel from scratch when we can borrow ideas from elsewhere.
I would agree. Can I jump in super quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Scroll.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, as Jack mentioned, it's it's probably the engineers who should have like the final word on network upgrades. There is something about vetoing mentioned earlier, like on Eiger, that coin holders have a veto. And I think that's actually quite dangerous, because it is possible to buy votes from individuals. And so if things can just get like bought and vetoed and cancelled, like there's not going to be any progress made. That's like one potential route of attack, I reckon. Yeah, there was something else Jack said, like I think we should figure out a cadence. So if we're really going to make this new mechanism real, we need to figure out a cadence. This relates to like the strategic direction. So the different organizations have like different project timelines, right? And so maybe in this funding block, there can be like specific voting periods, which could enable like voting for larger ZF ECC related type stuff, and like maybe once every quarter or something, there can be a voting period for smaller grants, and this might help like in terms of organizing the whole thing, right? The final thing, so with relating to the vetoing, maybe we should consider like delegating votes to different groups. And I'll just like one question I'll leave you with is, if engineers are going to be one voting group, do they also participate in ZF and ECC or Shielded Labs? Like, are they also going to be in the other groups, or are they separated from the organizations themselves that they're a part of?
Let me hit on that. I want to go back first to the engineers should have the final word thing, because I think that's important to address. So again, like I think it's I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so first, for folks that don't know, the zip editors, it's not a form of governance. So zip editors today have responsibility to take a look at the zips, make sure that they conform, raise kind of any issues, and perhaps make recommendations, but it's not governance, it's not decision making as it's structured today. Not saying what it should be, but that's what it is. Sometimes the decisions become more nuanced, because it used to, again, like it was more simple when we said there are, the ECC is doing the work, or, ECC and ZF is doing the work, but now you have other projects. So in the case of like the NSM, for example, we can say, well, Shielded Labs has a responsibility for doing 100% of the work. And so as long as they get all their work done within an amount of time, then we can include it. But there is, when we talk about complexity budget, there is complexity budget as it relates to the protocol. There's also complexity budget as it relates to the ecosystem, what the ecosystem can absorb. And those decisions have to come, factor in as well. So it's not just like we can theoretically get this code, implemented by another third party who's guaranteeing that they're going to have, done at a certain time. We're going to get the appropriate audits and reviews. Ensure everything's good, and get it merged with everything else. And now, like what we see with NSM, is there's interdependencies between ZSAs and NSM when it comes to things like burning mechanisms. So all of that is to say, I don't think it's not as simple as engineers should have the final word, and it depends on who you mean by engineers. But today, that's not the zip editors per governance. The question about the scroll that you had about participation, the idea with that is that if you have these organizations, the idea is that there would be redundant. To answer your question, there'd be some redundancy, right? So, but it would be more of a Venn, and the reason for that is that you might have, somebody like myself at the head of ECC who wants to kind of mandate a certain kind of direction or decision, or who is, playing politics or something like that in order to try to get to a certain outcome. Hopefully that's not me, but it could be something like that. And if this team was under, if this team wasn't able to speak freely because they were restricted in terms of their speech, in terms of what they could say about ECC, then the engineers at ECC might disagree and not have adequate voice. And so the idea with that other group was to say, okay, there's ECCs at ECC, there's EF, there's Shielded Labs, there's other, folks like Han and other people in the ecosystem. And can there be a separate group of people that are taking a look at this and signaling with their signature? And if they signal something that's different than the organizations maybe that they represent, then the community ought to take note. That might be a yellow flag. So that was the idea there.
I just want to respond to something there. I didn't mean to imply that engineers should have the final say. I meant to imply that engineers should have should have the final say in terms of what can be jammed into a single network upgrade. Not whether a feature should be deployed or not, but assuming it is to be deployed, whether it can be deployed alongside ZSAs, alongside memo bundles, alongside all of these other things that various people are wanting to get into and use of.
Thanks, Dodger. Any other thoughts on this topic? Okay, cool. Let's see. I just wanted to be clear, since it was referenced again by Squirrel. I was thinking of Eigenlayer, their recent governance post, and I dropped that in the chat. And so, yeah, we'll jump into the next question here, which Josh touched on in his overview, and it's come up a few times here so far. But at the outset, who should hold the signing keys for the Zcash Funding Bloc? And what should be the criteria to determine their selection? And a follow-up to that is, what process should be used to add or remove constituencies or delegates from the Z block? Somebody want to jump in with that?
I can start. Yeah, so like I said earlier, I think we should start off small and then iterate from there. So at the outset, I think it would make sense to have something like 5 to 7 core constituents. If it was 5, it could be somebody like ECC, ZF, Shielded Labs, Zec Hub, and coin holders. If it was 7, 2 other constituents that we might want to consider from the start are ZCG and the core engineers, but core engineers from different organizations. So there's not that influence from the leadership of a certain organization. And so I'm including coin holders for a couple of reasons. First, I think coin holders are incredibly important stakeholders because they're the ones who are using the network as a private store of value or a private medium of exchange. And I think that coin holders have been excluded from Zcash governance throughout its history. Only recently, with the mechanism that Han developed, have we been able to use it in a very experimental fashion. We used it during the dev fund discussions earlier this year. There was something like 500,000 ZEC that were voted, and the results aligned with other polls. So I think we should continue to try to use coin holders and make sure that they're represented. I think over the next few months, Han's going to address a lot of the issues that we've run into in previous polls and have a reliable implementation that can be used with other wallets that's fully auditable. And I think somebody brought up things like vote buying or plutocracy or vote manipulation. That is definitely a legitimate concern. And I think a long-term solution to that would be something like time-weighted voting, where you can sort of reduce the influence of short-term speculators. Another issue that we touched on is, I think, it's been tossed around whether organizations should have multiple keys for different departments or different groups. And I don't think that's a good idea. And just to expand on it, you can imagine like ECC's leadership team having a key, the engineering team having a key, another group having a third key, and then all those groups sort of effectively being influenced by the CEO or executive director. So if engineers had their own key, it's much better that it's made up of different organizations. And then somewhere along the line, like in the future, it would be good to include other contributors like, the Kedits and the chain safes of the world, and for the community to have representation in some fashion. Because I'm not sure, it's not clear, like if ZF would continue to pull ZCAP or ECC would pull ZAC under this current structure, or if it would just be like the leadership making the decision. And I have a feeling it would probably be the latter. So the community can have representation through something like ZEC Hub or some other means that we can figure out. And then the last thing I want to touch on is with regard to adding or removing constituents. I like the idea of a supermajority vote, but I still worry that there could be collusion where certain orgs team up to remove somebody they don't like for the sole reason that they don't like them, right? So one thing I've been sort of thinking about is maybe there could be entities that are inherently like Zcash mission focused that could not be removed. So that would be people who in their like formation docs have Zcash as their core mission. So like ECC, ZF, Shielded Labs, ZEC Hub. But contributors like Kedit or ChainSafe who, are, to be honest, if there's no funding, they're likely to leave, right? They could be removed by a supermajority vote. But yeah, I don't know. These are just ideas that I'm tossing out there, and I could probably be swayed a different way. But collusion, I think, is a legitimate concern that I think we need to sort of consider as we continue to have these discussions.
Any follow-up to those thoughts or the original question?
I think so. When I hear people talking about governance mechanisms and suggesting, let's do coin holder voting, or let's do this, or let's use that, I always look to see if they dog food it themselves, and specifically, I look to see whether they use it for something meaningful that affects them directly. So, the obvious example is that at ZF, we poll ZCAP on who should be appointed to the Zcash Foundation board, and later this week, the board will be meeting with the two candidates who received the most votes in that poll, and we'll find out the outcome in due course. So that's an example of what I mean by dog fooding, and I think anyone who wants to be taken seriously when they're proposing a new governance mechanism, I think they should demonstrate using it themselves.
Hey, I was kind of thinking that, yeah, like the main organizations that already exist could hold keys like ZF, ECC, Shielded Labs, GCG, and ZEC Hub. But in terms of adding or removing key holders, I think we already have something that works, which is like ZCAP and ZAC and ZEC Hub and the various polls that take place on the forum. Because again, like if we're thinking about this realistically, and of course, coin holders. Sorry, I forgot. I think coin holders should be like the one group which cannot be removed at any point. But anyway, yeah, I think if we're thinking about it realistically, these votes, how much time do people have? I don't think that these votes can take place like with the at the pace that like it might happen when we need to add or remove people. in addition to also funding projects, if that makes sense. And so like things like Zcap and Zach and ZecHub and the people on the forum, that's like a group of dedicated Zcashers who are always present and keeping on top of things. So they're ideal to figure out who is performing well and like, or who needs to be removed. Yeah, whereas organizing a whole vote on the funding block could take a lot of time, in my opinion.
So Squirrel, I agree that coin holders should be probably the one, right? And coin holders would change over time, and hopefully the coin holders will have, the worry with coin holders, and it's a whole separate debate, is plutocracy. If it's 100% coin holder vote, and especially in a world where there's, we value privacy and there's not transparency on where some of those votes are come from necessarily, then ultimately who's controlling the direction? You have a power that has the ability to amass a ton of tokens and ultimately control the fate. So that's the risky thing with the plutocracy, but having a significant voice and vote, I don't, that's something that should be sacrosanct, I think, in our community, that's just not enshrined anywhere today. The question of who is our community is it's very subjective. You had talked about like maybe others, or Jason had mentioned maybe others not being removed. I think that's a very dangerous precedent too. It's like saying, I mean, if an organization just becomes completely ineffective, or if it gets taken out, or if they're doing evil things, or if they're doing wrong things, and over and over and over again, or whatever, there should be a mechanism, I think, that allows for the community to clean house and to say, look, this organization, while it once was serving the best interests of the project, is no longer serving the best interests of the project, and it's best they move on. And if they want to, then they can fork the chain and do something else. But there should be an excellent mechanism to allow that, I think, so that this isn't brittle, but it's resilient. And the other reason, again, it's just like it creates over the long term. If you don't have that, we want these organizations to be accountable for outcomes. And if you don't have any accountability, it leads to perverse incentives. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, Squirrel, you're talking about Zach and Zcap and others that are polling. So it's our intent. It's ECC's intent. In this model, each organization may have different mechanisms for assessing community sentiment. So the foundation has Zcap. We developed Zach. It's our intent, if something like this were to be implemented, to use Zach to influence a decision. Whether it's binding or not, like Zcat for a foundation is non-binding. It's helpful in determining sentiment. Like ZecHub, if ZecHub was involved as a DAO, may have a different mechanism or a different threshold for determining sentiment within that community. And so I think what this proposal is intended to be a blend of those things.
Yeah, just to respond to that one, I do agree with you that, like, my goal in saying that is that I want to mitigate collusion or politicking, or a group of orgs teaming up on another org, not sort of incentivize orgs to not perform or to engage in bad behavior. So yeah, there has to be some sort of mechanism where if an organization becomes completely ineffective, and the consensus is that's the case, then we would have to remove them, even if it was a core Zcash organization.
Any other thoughts on this topic? All right, we'll jump to the next one and try to stay on time here. So with the lockbox expiring in less than a year, what is actually technically feasible to implement within that short time frame, or relatively short time frame? And what potential interim measures could be introduced to manage governance and funding until the Z block or another proposal becomes fully operational?
Yeah, so because I explored this I've explored this question in terms of what's feasible a little bit. You know, the idea of the K event multi-sig, the idea is that we could use something like Frost to be able to do that, and so technically that's feasible. But the reality is that in 2025 is fairly well baked. So with network upgrade 7, and I think there's probably some changes to that schedule that will come out. That's up to the zip editors to kind of share where things sit against that current timeline. The current timeline has that one, for example, at August, and the conversations have been, well, there's probably at a minimum 3 months between network upgrades in terms of what the broader ecosystem can digest, and it's more likely 6. So if you just do that math, you say, okay, the current one is in U7, then at best, absolute best case, which I don't believe is feasible, is in U8. If something like this got implemented, would be November, and then that's like right up against the edge. And I think this is going to take a little bit longer time. So it's either that the in terms of this proposal, if this kind of proposal were to move forward, my guess is that there would need to be an extension on the current one, or something would need to change. And it's likely a 2026 kind of best case. But that's just my gut.
Any other timeline thoughts or feasibility, interim steps, things of that sort?
I mean, one thing I'll say is with regard to interim measures that can be introduced to manage funding until something like this becomes operational, is I think we already have those. Like we have ZCG, we have ZecHub. So ECC and ZF have the ability to apply for ZCG grants if they need the funding. ZCG is also continuing to receive an allocation of the block rewards through 2025 to fund independent development and community projects. So, if we can keep that going, I think that's a good thing. And I think ZCG should, set up ZecHub with the resources to fund small grants and, different community marketing and education initiatives. But yeah, time's ultimately the factor. Like we've got a lot to do in a short amount of time, and I think we just need to talk more frequently. Like one thing I pitched to both Dodger and Josh separately is having biweekly public calls similar to the Arborist calls about these governance issues, and that sort of forces us to stay on top of it and make progress. So something we should consider doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Squirrel or Dodger, any thoughts on this question?
I think that the more complex something is, the longer it's going to take to agree and to implement. And the simpler the solution is, the quicker it will be to agree and implement. To my mind, the simplest approach would be to open up a request for grants, let people put forward their proposal, how much they want to receive and what they plan to do with it, and then just pull the community. And by the community, to be clear, I'm talking about ZCAP. I think this nonsense of having all these different groups is just ridiculous. I think polling ZCAP and saying, right, which one of these do you want to fund, and then that process that I described earlier from the that we used for minor grants, which is the ones that receive the most approval get funded first, and then perhaps we put a limit on it. Perhaps as we did with minor grants, we limited the amount. So maybe we do that here to ensure that there's not one kind of blockbuster proposal that purports to turn, to be a superpower for Zcash. I think is the one that we usually hear, and that then ends up sucking up all the funding, and there's nothing else left for everybody else. It's progress, not perfection. I think given the multitude of different views, we're never going to reach something that is perfection. I think the best we can hope for is a compromise that makes everybody equally unhappy. But it is doable. It is possible, and it means that we get to move forward, and we can iterate as we go forward. One of the big mistakes I think we made with there are two big mistakes that I think were made with ZIP 1014. Was number one, there was this expectation that it was set in stone for 4 years. Now, of course, it wasn't in the end, but there was that kind of anchoring effect that meant that nobody, I think, really got ready or prepared to step up and to propose themselves as an alternative recipient. And then the second one actually is echoing something that's been talked about before, was accountability. The ZIP 1014 imposed certain obligations, and a lot of those obligations were simply not met. But there was no mechanism for holding people accountable. So yeah, I think that having more frequent funding rounds is bad, because it means that there's more kind of more effort and energy devoted to arguing and debating and discussing who should get funding for what. But it does mean that we can be more reactive to when organizations don't do what they claimed they were going to do, don't fulfill their obligations, and I think it de-risks. So that, one of the things that Squirrel mentioned earlier is that the ECC and ZF engage in long-term projects, and that's absolutely true. If we had applied for a grant to deliver Zebra, I don't think we'd have got one. And I think that going further, hopefully the projects will not be quite so long. I think it'll be possible to make more iterative progress. But at the same time, one of the big things that I'm concerned about is the sort of tragedy of the commons, where we end up with exciting, shiny new projects that have got a lot of marketing behind them, getting funded, and then the core maintenance of the protocol being effectively neglected. Anybody who's familiar with what happened with OpenSSL will understand that is a real threat, and that also in itself potentially introduces bottlenecks. One of the issues that we've had in the past was that teams have come to Zcash. People like Bolt Labs, indeed Kedit, demoed ZSAs on Zcash a year and a half ago, but weren't able to progress because they weren't getting traction with getting their stuff added into Zcash, and then ultimately the decision was made to transition to Zebra. So there's this kind of shadow veto that can happen, and I want to say right up front that from our perspective, when we are never gonna adopt that attitude with Zebra. We will look to the community just as we did 3 years ago when we asked them what should the priorities be for Zcash, and we'll probably do that again in the not too distant future. We'll look to the community to see what they want to see in the Zcash core protocol, and we will prioritize those things as much as we can. But yeah, I think to return to the original question, I think that what's doable is something simple and very much imperfect, but hopefully an improvement on what we had previously.
So
can I just respond to something that Dodger said quickly? I think so. With regard to pulling ZCAP for grants, I think it's good if ZF wants to establish its own grants program, but I think it's clear to a lot of us on this call and within the community that it's time to move towards a more decentralized governance model. Like Zcap isn't governance, it's an advisor for the Zcash Foundation. We've had this conversation for so many years now. These sorts of panels can help inform organizations about community sentiment, but they're not inherently forms of governance themselves. Like, it's too centralized. So I think we've sort of moved past that conversation, and something along the lines of the Z block or something else is sort of what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think the community by that, Jack, I'd be a little careful when you call those other surveys that were done nonsense, because they were the community really standing up and stepping out and saying, we want something new. We don't want to do this anymore the way this has been done. I don't call it nonsense. I think that's progress. And so here we are, like you're right in terms of keeping something as simple as possible and then evolving over time. I mean, it's similar advice we got with a few of us, including Jason and myself, met with the Optimism team, because they've been going through kind of similar governance things, and they gave similar kind of advice, but pushing more towards decentralization and the inclusion of other voices across the ecosystem. You had mentioned, Dodger, the core maintenance being neglected. One of the things in the proposal, or kind of an idea that I put out there, was that you could carve up that funding block into different pieces. And I think Chris had stated something similar, Chris Nidicombe, and Jason, you may have as well, where you take a percentage of the funding block and you say this is allocated specifically towards maintenance projects, versus another percentage that's maybe like long-term speculative. So by long-term speculative, I mean, there was a time where, Sean Bowe was just given time to go do some research that may or may not ever pay off. And, he discovered Halo 2 as a result, which is a huge breakthrough. And there may be other things like that. We may want to say, okay, we need somebody to go explore post-quantum crypto, which is kind of a timely conversation this week with Google. But and we may never get to an answer, or the answer actually may be discovered by somebody else, but we want to pay for that work independent of or under different kinds of accountability mechanisms. And so maybe there's a pool for speculative stuff or something like that. But I think there's ways to get there.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, so we had one more question slated about opportunities and challenges, but honestly, I think everybody kind of touched on that throughout the call. And with these last 10 minutes, maybe we'll open it up to the audience. If anybody wants to raise their hand, we'll open it up for some questions. And if not, I'll ask that last question, and we can kind of round it out with some final thoughts. I'll just keep an eye out here for a moment. Okay, looks like nobody has raised their hand, so let's circle back to this broader last question here. What do you guys see as the biggest opportunity or challenge in transitioning Zcash governance and funding to a structure like the Zcash Funding Bloc? Or even final, closing thoughts on the topic at large.
Yeah, I think like the biggest opportunity is if we can create something that works, we can create a more decentralized funding and governance model that sort of carries Zcash forward into the long term. And we don't have to have these conversations every 4 years or every year. But the biggest challenge is that there's a lot to do in a short amount of time. Like it amazes me how long things take to get done in Zcash. When it comes to these sorts of governance initiatives, both with the previous dev fund discussions and now this like governance and funding mechanism, it feels like we tend to wait for the last minute to sort of get our butts in gear. So ideally, these conversations would have started months ago. I know Josh tried, and it seemed like the community wasn't ready, and that might be because we just came out of months of dev fund discussions, and people just were sort of burned out. But I think we should make an an effort in the new year to start making progress on these discussions.
Yeah, I agree. Like the time's now, the clock's ticking. Hey, we're all motivated, right? So in the in some sense, things are slow for various reasons or decisions that were made in the past. So we can go down. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole right now. But the reality is that I know, like on our end, we're moving quicker, and we have a financial incentive. Like if we want to get a grant to be able to ensure that we have longer term sustainability, like we have to get a mechanism in place. So there is that kind of financial reality, independent of also the pain that we're feeling, like we've described as it relates to network upgrades, how those decisions get made, independent of the technology, what should be done, to Dodger's point, in what order those things should be done. Like we need to get something figured out, and I think we need to get something figured out definitely within this calendar year. And I think there's good models. So, as raised before, is that we don't necessarily need to reinvent. This isn't a complete reinvention. It's some borrowed ideas. There's again, the other one that's thrown out there is the optimism model, which is a bicameral model that includes delegates as well as coin holders participating in that one. I think that's great to look at. And then if there's others, like bring them forward and like to have the conversation. But I think starting to coalesce around this stuff like within the first second quarter of next year, I think is really important.
Dodger.
Yeah, I think the entire community suffered from a certain amount of governance fatigue. I think after the last round, and the sheer number of polls, and I was getting messages from people saying, "Hey, I've been asked to participate in this poll. Is this for real? Is this a real poll, or what's going on?" And that's what I talk about when I talk about the nonsense. Sean, mine Zcash, made a very sensible suggestion that we should get together and agree how to come up with a single group that everybody can poll, and tried to make that happen, but unfortunately some people weren't willing to collaborate on that, and that was very disappointing. But yeah, I think and the other thing I would say is that our goal should be reaching a consensus, and in consensus it means that not everybody is happy. I think if people dig their heels in and they insist that their way is the only way, and they're going to keep on causing drama and arguing and whatnot, then all that's going to happen is we're going to drive even more people away from this community. We've lost a lot of people from this community, a lot of very valuable people who have just looked at the drama, looked at the threat of being slandered and criticized by people, with high profile positions, and they've just gone, screw this, I'm out. So I would say to everybody here, have a long, hard think about how you conduct yourselves, and have a long, hard think about whether you're really interested in reaching compromise, in reaching consensus, or whether you just want to win. Because if you want to win for your own sake, for your own purposes, then Zcash is going to lose. The only way that Zcash wins is if we are prepared to work together, to collaborate, to compromise, and to reach a consensus that maybe we're all a little bit unhappy with, but is at least progress, if not what any of us individually regard as perfection.
Were you talking to anybody in particular, or you have something? I mean, you're throwing out some broad stuff. They're pretty serious kinds of comments. You said people here. So can you be a little bit more specific about what you mean?
No, I'm just saying that, you know, the people who are putting forward proposals and arguing in favor of specific approaches, don't get sucked into trying to win for yourselves. I think focus on what's best for Zcash.
Dodger, I think there's great earnest going on here with people putting forth proposals in good faith and trying to have meaningful discussions about this stuff. I don't think anybody is trying to win.
Hey everyone. Yes, I'm optimistic. So yeah, Zcash did have a few people leave, but what we're doing now is actually the solution that had been proposed by many of the people that were unhappy, and so I think we're actually fixing some of their concerns through things like this funding block and other proposals that people want to bring forward. There is so in terms of like the polling and governance fatigue that occurs, this is like the major thing that I'm trying to get across in terms of this funding block and the cadence of votes that are going to have to happen, right? So we don't want to overwhelm people with too much stuff happening all the time. So it's a really good idea. I'd love to see like people push or build on this funding block idea a bit further by like presenting a potential cadence for, let's say, larger grants that are going to happen and shorter term grants. And so that, you know, we could actually like build a calendar and say like, if you have an idea for a network upgrade, it has to be done by this time or within a certain number of months, and like actually start to make it happen, right?
Thanks, Squirrel. Yeah. Okay, so we're coming up on time here. And yeah, just to kind of some closing thoughts for me, I just, I also don't think that anybody's trying to win here. I think we all want the community and Zcash to win. And this is just a starting point, right? There's 2 proposals out there. As Josh said, we're looking to have poke holes in it. As Squirrels just said, like come up, like add to it. And I think everybody here would love to see more proposals, and we'd love to discuss them on calls like this. And so with that, thanks everybody for being here. I'll toss it back over to Jason to close us out.
Yeah, nothing to add other than let's make an effort to continue to have these conversations on a frequent basis so we can get something done next year.
Jason and Dan, thanks for setting this up and for hosting. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Merry Christmas.
Cheers.
Cheers,
Merry
everybody.
Christmas and a Happy New Year.